I, Ibrahim Traoré, declare that Africa will no longer be a playground for foreign powers. Our sovereignty is not for sale, and we will protect it with unwavering resolve.
On a calm Tuesday morning at exactly 8 a.m., the city of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso awoke to an unusual sight. Military trucks rolled steadily through the streets, their engines rumbling like distant thunder as they closed in on a plain, unremarkable office building in the city's east. Soldiers stepped out with measured precision, boots striking the pavement in sync. Without a word, they moved inside, swift and deliberate. What they found was no ordinary office stacks of classified documents, hard drives brimming with data, and encrypted phones sat waiting, the tools of a covert operation. Outside, the sign bore the name of an innocent-looking telecommunications company. But beneath its polished exterior lay something far more dangerous. The government of Burkina Faso, led by a resolute leader named Traoré, had uncovered the truth. This was no telecom firm. It was a covert outpost working for Israel, quietly gathering intelligence on the region. This raid was no spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the opening move in a meticulously planned offensive. By 11 a.m., Traoré's forces had dismantled 6 more Israeli-linked companies scattered across the country. Their networks went dark, their operations ground to a halt, and their guarded secrets were seized. There were no dramatic speeches or media alerts, just cold, decisive efficiency. This was more than a cleanup of foreign espionage. It was a calculated message aimed straight at Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister. The move signaled the beginning of a deeper campaign, one that threatened to append decades of quiet foreign influence in Africa. For years, Israel had been weaving a discreet web across the continent. Few paid attention. Outwardly, the deals looked harmless: defense partnerships, technology transfers, development aid. They promised prosperity and security, but beneath the surface, each contract came with invisible strings. Many were designed to grant Israel access to Africa's most guarded information, details on resource deposits, political strategies, and even migration routes. Some companies, like the one in Ouagadougou, were little more than camouflage for intelligence-gathering hubs, feeding sensitive data back to Tel Aviv under the cover of normal business. Traoré had been watching all of this unfold, patiently collecting evidence. He knew these deals had nothing to do with uplifting Africa; they were tools of control. Under Netanyahu's leadership, Israel had crafted a system to monitor and shape African affairs from the shadows, but Traoré was not a leader to be quietly managed. When he decided to strike, he did so without hesitation. By 2:00 p.m. that same Tuesday, Traoré faced the press. The room was tense but silent as cameras focused in. He didn't shout or pound the podium, his calm tone only sharpened the edge of his words. "Africa is not your blind spot anymore," he declared. The statement wasn't for the local audience or even for Africa's neighbors. It was a direct challenge to Benjamin Netanyahu, a public unveiling of Israel's hidden reach. Africa, Traoré insisted, would no longer be a playground for covert influence. Then came the final blow. He announced the immediate termination of every defense and surveillance contract with Israel operating in Burkina Faso. The message was unmistakable. Foreign manipulation would be met with swift, uncompromising action. Any organization tied to foreign intelligence was given a blunt order: leave Burkina Faso. Diplomats suspected of running covert operations had until sunrise to pack their bags. By nightfall, images began flooding social media, stripped office spaces once buzzing with Israeli-linked activity, computers sealed in crates, soldiers guiding staff out under watchful eyes. Military trucks rumbled away, stacked with boxes of encrypted communication gear. Traoré hadn't asked for permission, he hadn't issued threats. He simply acted, and the world took notice. The shockwaves didn't stop at Burkina Faso's borders. By evening, African neighbors were taking decisive steps of their own. Mali announced an immediate freeze on all imports of Israeli military hardware. Guinea halted joint cybersecurity ventures. Niger went even further, launching a full probe into foreign-backed infrastructure deals, suspecting hidden spy networks. Within them, in just 72 hours, 3 nations had joined Burkina Faso's defiance. The movement spread like a rising tide, with more countries poised to follow. Inside Israel, panic set in. Netanyahu called an emergency war room meeting with his top advisors. Leaks to the press painted scenes of urgency. Advisors hunched over maps and reports, scrambling to assess the damage. One was overheard telling Netanyahu, "This isn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. He's building a wall against us," and they were right. Traoré's campaign was bigger than shuttering a few companies. It was a blueprint for how Africa could defend itself from shadow influence. This was no impulsive crackdown. Traoré was executing a calculated vision he called the counterintelligence doctrine. At its core were 3 unshakable pillars: total transparency. Foreign companies and governments operating in Africa would fully disclose their activities, with no hidden contracts or concealed agendas. Zero tolerance. Any caught in secret operations would be expelled without warning. And mutual defense. African nations would share intelligence and guard each other's sovereignty. It was a continent-wide shield against exploitation, regardless of whether the threat came from Israel, America, Europe, or anywhere else. For decades, powerful nations had cloaked their ambitions in promises of aid and cooperation. They offered weapons, technology, and loans, but the fine print often gave them control over Africa's gold, oil, and strategic resources. They mapped mineral deposits, monitored governments, and sowed divisions to keep countries weak. Traoré called them out without flinching. "You funded our divisions. You mapped our minerals. You called us unstable when we refused your chains." It was a blunt indictment of a system that smiled while tightening the grip of dependency. Past leaders had been pressured into silence, signing deals in smoky backrooms that favored foreign capitals over African cities. But Traoré was rewriting the script. In Ouagadougou, crowds surged outside the presidential compound, not in protest, but in celebration. Young men and women waved banners reading "Africa is not for sale" and "No more shadows." For the first time in years, people saw their leader not as a pawn, but as a shield. The pride was palpable, but it was more than just a surge of patriotism. It was the return of hope. For generations, Africans had lived under leaders who wore the suits of statesmen, but thought like colonizers' agents. Traoré's defiance gave them something tangible, proof that the chains could be broken, and that Africa could speak in its own voice. In the eyes of his people, Traoré wasn't just a president. He was their voice. Across Burkina Faso, conversations shifted. Freedom wasn't just about breaking the grip of old colonial masters, but about resisting the modern powers that sought to control Africa by subtler means. In Jerusalem, Netanyahu's anger boiled over, but his hands were tied. Military intervention was out of the question. It would ignite an international storm. Diplomatic outreach was equally impossible. His envoys were being escorted out. Even his usual backers, like Washington and European capitals, offered no lifeline. The US mumbled something about restraint and dialogue, a statement as weightless as smoke. France, normally quick to defend Israel, said nothing. The EU stayed silent too. They all understood the truth. Traoré's defiance wasn't just his own. He was the face of a growing African chorus tired of being managed like pieces on someone else's board. Inside Israel, analysts gave this rising philosophy a name: the Traoré Doctrine. And they feared it. Israel's billion-dollar trade in arms, surveillance tools, and military tech across Africa wasn't just about revenue, it was about access. These deals gave them eyes on mineral-rich zones, migration patterns, and political shifts. If Traoré's rules caught on, Israel stood to lose not only money, but influence. For Netanyahu, this wasn't an isolated flare-up, it was a gathering storm, and the momentum was undeniable. Reports surfaced of 6 West African nations quietly drafting a joint blacklist of foreign companies accused of espionage or political meddling, Israeli firms topping the list. Security agencies began pulling intelligence, weaving a net of regional self-defense with no foreign hands pulling the strings. For the first time, Africa was building a united shield against covert manipulation. The African Union, representing 54 nations, was rumored to be drafting a resolution echoing Traoré's stance, urging members to reject secret foreign operations and reclaim their resources. What happened in Burkina Faso was no longer a local affair, it was the spark of a continental shift. For centuries, Africa had been treated as a storehouse to plunder its gold, oil, and diamonds carved up by outsiders, its people uprooted, its borders redrawn by foreign rulers. Even after independence, invisible chains of debt, weapon deals, and hidden contracts kept the influence alive. But Traoré's actions had sent an unmistakable signal: Africa would no longer be silent, nor passive. By dismantling Israel's shadow network, he warned every major power: Africa sees you, and Africa is ready. The Traoré Doctrine was more than a spy purge. It was a set of tools for sovereignty-arming nations with the means to reject unfair deals, shield their borders from covert control, and speak in their own collective voice. Still, no one doubted. The fight ahead, the powers Traoré challenged, had deep pockets and global reach. Israel might retaliate by cutting off aid or tech. Other countries could squeeze African economies to pressure them back into line. Some leaders might falter, tempted by the perks of foreign partnerships, but Traoré's real strength was not in statecraft alone, it was in the people. From Ouagadougou's markets to distant villages, citizens saw in him something rare, a leader unafraid to challenge the old order. His defiance inspired youth movements, civil society groups, and even sympathetic officials in neighboring states. If the ranks of his allies grew, Africa could present a united front strong enough to force even the most powerful nations to think twice. Traoré's dismantling of Netanyahu's network was not a mere act of political boldness, it was a pivot point in history. For too long, Africa had been treated as an open field where foreign powers played without limits. Now, someone had drawn a line in the sand and dared the world to cross it. Traoré is proving that this old narrative no longer holds. His actions have shown that African nations can stand shoulder to shoulder, defend their sovereignty, and command respect on their own terms. The Traoré Doctrine could mark the dawn of a new era, one where Africa writes the rules and guards its own destiny. This isn't just about Burkina Faso or Israel. It's about every African nation tired of being treated like a pawn on someone else's chessboard. It's about every citizen who wants their voice to shape their country's future. From Mali to Guinea to Niger, the spark is already catching. More nations may follow, building a wave of unity powerful enough to redraw the balance of power on the continent. Traoré's stand against Netanyahu has sent shockwaves far beyond Africa's borders. It has forced the world to confront a truth long ignored: Africa will no longer be managed in silence. Yet this is only the beginning. The questions remain: will other leaders take up the torch? Will the Traoré Doctrine become the blueprint for a sovereign, self-determined Africa? And how far will powerful nations go to try to stamp it out? The answers will be written not just in government halls, but in the streets, in the villages, and in the voices of ordinary people. If you believe this moment matters, speak of it. Share it, let it echo, because this is more than politics. It's the story of a continent standing tall, refusing to be silent, and demanding to be heard.